The lessons of Not-Brexit: political change is of benefit only if it leads to a Christian spiritual awakening. Bruce Charlton. For those of you in other countries, it is important to emphasize that Brexit never happened. What we eventually got, 2.5 years delayed, was a BRINO, a Brexit in name only, a paper exercise slightly reorganizing the globalist bureaucracy. I was completely on the side of Brexit, and I was very pleased that a large majority of English people, except in London, were on the Brexit side. However, I was under no illusions that the positive Brexit vote was an opportunity and not an answer. The opportunity was for a national spiritual awakening. The blog Albion Awakening was created on exactly that basis, that there was a window of opportunity unexpectedly opening, but unless that opportunity was taken by enough people, then Brexit would yield no net positive benefit to the nation, but only to the careers of a few opportunistic, Brexit-supporting politicians. And it did not. The fact that a self-styled Brexit day happened in the midst of the winter 2020-21 pandemic lockdown and on the cusp of the PEC onslaught makes that clear. As does the continued massive levels of immigration to the UK, including officially the highest ever levels of illegal immigration, i.e. more than a year after so-called Brexit. Yet stopping mass immigration was without any doubt by far the major issue that caused people to vote for Brexit. The official immigration, especially illegal, numbers are, of course, calculatedly dishonest, and huge underestimates, but it may be that there were around 1 million, or more, immigrants in a single year, i.e. enough people to fill a city the size of Birmingham, the second largest city in England, after London. In all observable ways and very obviously, England post-Brexit continues to be ruled such as to weaken, subvert and destroy the nation. Most recently, through 2023, the lying, insane, and irrational UK propaganda, subsidies, theft, probable sabotage, aggression and multiple other provocations against the anti-fire nation have made us prime military targets, if the British establishment achieve the war escalations they so assiduously are trying to engineer. In sum, Brexit did England no good, because the opportunity it provided for repentance and spiritual reform was decisively rejected, and having rejected that opportunity the nation was left in a worse state, as revealed by the trends since 2016. I think this is a general lesson teaching us that, as of these times, all politics as such will lead to evil, including even when it is motivated, as was Brexit, by supporting the lesser of two evils. The lesser of two evils is still evil. And by engaging us in the pursuit of evil, albeit lesser, we are corrupted and ourselves made more evil. This is of extreme relevance to the ongoing war. Here there is no doubt which of the sides is less evil, yet the victory of the lesser evil would not lead to net good unless the winning side is, overall, motivated by good. In other words, if the effect of the war on the Fire Nation is to make it more primarily Christian, more Christian motivated, then a victory would probably be net good, for that nation, and probably for the world as a whole. If Christian faith is sufficiently strongly deepened and refined in the crucible of war, such that it is then restored to become a ruling principle of the nation, then the spiritual effect of war might be net positive. But, if, as often happens, war causes a corruption of motivations and a win at all costs and at any price and by any means kind of mentality, then victory would harm the victors and the world. And there is no doubt that one of the core objectives of the anti-Fire Nation actions has been to corrupt that nation with the same spirit of satanic evil as rules the West. We among the masses are all but powerless in a material sense, all the power we possess is spiritual. It is therefore vital that we develop and maintain spiritual discernment in relation to this continuing and escalating global war. We need to consider carefully what we choose to know, and what we choose to believe, about events and motives, always bearing in mind the provenance of claims, from where, ultimately and spiritually, claims emanate. There is no safe option and no safe opinion. Situations change and the need for discernment is continuous. To assert incompetence is a self-subordination, refusing to judge is itself a judgment. And what matters is that we each take personal responsibility for our spiritual attitudes and aspirations. Even though mistakes are inevitable, if we do this sincerely, then over time we will be led to the truth, because we will be open to divine guidance. One reason why I believe that personal spiritual responsibility is required. Bruce Charlton. I have often said here that, in this time and place, we are required to take personal responsibility for our own salvation and spiritual development, theosis. This applies even when we are serious members of a Christian church. In fact, I think all serious Christians actually do this in practice, even when they deny it in theory. They may state and argue that they are primarily obedient to a church, but if they are, nonetheless, real Christians, then in truth they will be practicing personal discernment with respect to that church, and, in effect, choosing what they obey, and disregarding those instructions which they regard as wrong. The incoherence between obedience in theory, and discernment in practice, means that such Christians are weakened and made more vulnerable in the long term. Given that all major Christian, and other, Western churches are corrupt as of 2023, and getting worse, the alternative is to say and do what one believes in the heart to be wrong, and to follow an already corrupt church ever further into evil. Such a person cannot remain a Christian, and that will soon become publicly evident. He will obediently follow his church away from Christ, which means ceasing to desire resurrected eternal life in heaven as his primary goal. He will, in his heart, subordinate this transcendental Christian goal to a focus on this world, this earthly mortal life, so that the eternal gets fitted into the mortal. This because of the ever greater convergence of his church with the evil-dominated secular left materialist ideology that dominates the West. To obey the church is to serve Satan, already and increasingly. Metaphysics by means of understanding the nature and purpose of God. Bruce Charlton. Metaphysics is the philosophy of our primary assumptions concerning the nature of reality. For a Christian, this can be simplified into the primary theology of understanding the nature and purposes of God the Creator. Most Christian theologians through history have made the assumption that, in the beginning, God's creation was wholly good, for example the angels in heaven, the Garden of Eden, and that the purpose of God through history has been to develop man's agency, or freedom. Thus, man began as good but unfree, and God has worked through history to develop in man a freedom that then chooses good. I believe in contrast, that reality began with meaningless and purposeless chaos, but a chaos that included God the Creator and also men. Thus both God and men began as beings with agency. Men began as free, but unconscious. God has worked through history to develop man's consciousness, aiming at the point when man would, from his innate agency, consciously choose to align with God. Since we must discern the truth and goodness of complex and informationally overwhelming issues, such as climate, health, race and war, how can this validly be done by ordinary people? Bruce Charlton. If we wrongly assume that correct judgment is reached from the evidence, then there would be no possible way that ordinary people can ever judge complex issues such as climate change, health, with respect to the birdemic and its spec, race justice, and the Fire Nation War, to mention just some of the litmus tests of 2023. But equally there is no way that experts can evaluate these issues, since experts are all specialists, knowledgeable and competent, by current standards, only in ever narrower fields, and there is no such thing, in the modern world, by current criteria, as a generalist expert. What this means is that, if correct judgment really was reached from expert knowledge and skill applied to evidence, there can be no valid judgment on any complex issue, and the situation is inevitably one of the blind leading the blind. Of course, the actual situation is indeed overwhelmingly one of the blind, and purposively evil, leading the blind, and passively evil. But this situation is not inevitable. It would only be inevitable if correct judgment derived from expertise and evidence. But that is false. Correct judgment is derived from correct assumptions, and good judgment is derived from motivation towards the good, which is harmonious alignment with God's creation and its purposes. This means that valid discernment is possible to anyone who has the right attitudes. Roughly, right attitudes means, 1. He takes the side of God/good/divine creation, and 2. He is able to discern whether or not information/theories/attitudes/opinions/strategies/policies/laws etc. come from those on the side of good. Only if someone has right attitudes, can he evaluate the evidence and learn from experience so that the inevitable mistakes get corrected. By contrast, those with wrong attitudes will interpret evidence wrongly, and will neither acknowledge nor learn from their wrongness. In other words, with right attitudes, discernment is a matter of the provenance of assertions. Provenance means where they come from. All that need be known is whether the assertions come from the side of good, or the side of evil. And it is very easy for those with right attitudes to know when assertions come from the side of evil. In fact, for those part of Western civilization in particular, discernment of provenance has never been easier in the history of the world. In conclusion, not only is it easy for ordinary people validly to discern the truth and goodness of complex issues, in practice ordinary people who are spiritually outside of the system are just about the only ones who can make valid discernments. Insofar as expertise and evidence have anything to do with it, they are a disadvantage to discernment, and there is an obvious, overall inverse relationship between expertise and being informed about a complex issue, and the chance of reaching true and good conclusion on that issue. Note, this is an extension into the spiritual realm of the psychological phenomenon of clever sillies that I floated some years ago, and which has gained considerable traction in some quarters. That is, I sought explanations for the observation that, up to a point, the more intelligent a person, the less likely they are to be correct about matters of common sense and personal experience. Here, intelligence is only a part of wrong discernment insofar as it is a proxy for being an informed and trained expert, but for several decades there are deliberate but indirect strategic policies that reduce average intelligence among the class of experts. Furthermore, the clever silly's idea fails to take into account that motivation is of prime importance to discernment and therefore good outcomes. Good is more than a choice of lesser evils, and requires a transcendental, next-worldly, orientation. The Spiritual Immorality of Materialist Morality. William Wildblood. Here are some frequently repeated sayings which are believed to encapsulate the essence of good moral behavior as far as the modern mind is concerned, but which are all wrong. Sometimes only slightly wrong, but it's the gap between partial and full truth that is critical. These sayings may shine superficially, but if you mistake them for sound moral instruction you will stay becalmed in materialistic thought, whether or not you believe in a God or spiritual background to the universe. Number 1. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't harm anyone else. This is the classic. It's the foundation stone of humanist ideological dogma, which might sound good at first glance but is highly deceptive. It is certainly wrong as interpreted, but it is also wrong as it stands. For it matters very much what you do if you harm yourself, and there are many things you might do that may not harm others but do damage you, especially on a spiritual level. And the fact is, you do not belong to yourself. You belong to God first and foremost, because He created you, and therefore if you harm yourself you also do harm to Him. But even if we ignore that, wrong actions and even wrong thoughts that do damage on the spiritual plane are sins, a sin being something that does harm to the spiritual self. Sexual sins, to take the most obvious example, may not directly harm anyone else if the people involved are consenting, but engaging in such sins harms the culture and therefore it does harm others who may be influenced to wrong behavior. There is physical and psychological hurt, but there is also spiritual hurt, and just because this is not recognized by an atheistic society does not mean it does not exist. I would go so far as to say that even unbelief harms others because it contributes to a culture of unbelief and therefore harms people influenced by the culture, as we all are to some degree. Denying God does harm yourself and it also harms others, and, as God is the fundamental truth, one might say that denying God is the gravest sin, even though to the secular mind it doesn't appear to harm anyone. Besides, proper morality is not about simple harm avoidance but has to do with living in harmony with the universe on all its levels, from physical to spiritual. Number 2. Love thy neighbor. The truth is, love your neighbor. The distortion comes from misinterpreting what this love means. In the Bible, the commandment to love your neighbor follows the one to love God and is contingent on it. This means that the love you show your neighbor must involve an awareness of God. It must be a love that supports the neighbor in his relationship with God, not exclusively, but that must be an underlying factor. It does not mean universal altruism. See Francis Berger's insightful post, which is a materialistic corruption of proper love, and nor does it mean you must treat your neighbor with kindness and respect regardless of how he behaves. Loving your neighbor, if it is not founded on the love for God, may actually be immoral in that it potentially separates the soul from God, which is the greatest evil. Besides, there is no proper love outside of God, certainly not in the spiritual sense, and spiritual love is the root of all lesser loves. Without it, these lesser loves are like one-dimensional representations of a three-dimensional solid. Number 3. You don't need God to be good. Without an awareness of God, you don't even know what good is. You reduce good to material good, which may well support spiritual evil. Even Jesus denied personal goodness. How much less can any one of us claim goodness? All goodness comes from God because He is the source and the very definition of it. Not only do you need God to be good, there is no goodness without God. The point to take away from this is that any form of morality which ignores the primacy of the spiritual and the love due from a created being to its creator is severely deficient and may actually be profoundly immoral. The word due may confuse because it implies obligation, but in this context it merely means that which feeds and makes grow the soul. Community consensus is one big reason why people really believe nonsense. Bruce Charlton. Why do so many people, especially those in leadership positions, believe things that are false? Of course, the ultimate reason for rampant falseness is dishonesty, since the world is ruled by evil, and evil always lies. But proximately, how does it happen? What is the psychological mechanism by which so many people believe stuff that is contradicted at the personal level? And also believe it to the extent of staking their own livelihood and lives on the truth of nonsense? One important answer is committee consensus. Although I hated and avoided committees throughout my career, nonetheless I attended more than enough of them to recognize their cognitively distorting effect. This is a psychological aspect of committees which comes on top of their objective deficiencies as a decision-making method, and the destructive evils of voting to make decisions. This is the way in which committees reach a consensus, which is then assumed to define reality. I have seen this innumerable times. A committee has to decide on something that is, or should be regarded, as a matter of fact, but the actual reason for a decision pushes facts down to the level of personal opinions, and personal opinions are framed in terms such as in-group versus out-group, people you like / are powerful / from whom we want favors, versus the opposite. After a while, the members of the committee often reach a conviction of the rightness of whatever they have decided, and that rightness has nothing to do with the real world, and everything to do with that psychological state of conviction. Then, on top, there is way in which committees integrate with the minutes and conclusions, the results and recommendations, of previous committees, such that the web of committee become the only valid reality. In other words, the system of bureaucracy operates on the implicit and unconscious assumption that there is no reality out with the system of bureaucracy, no reality with which to compare and contrast the committee world. And this assumption is all the more powerful for being implicit and unconscious, since it is so absurd that if examined explicitly it could not stand. Yet consensus can be, and of course is, routinely engineered by well-understood techniques. Yet those who are thus manipulated nearly always deny that it has happened. Probably because personal status and power, and employment, is conditional upon committee consensus. At every level of modern society of which we are aware and in all major institutions, a committee stands at the apex of power. Therefore, there is no limit to the wrongness with which committees can, formally and officially, regard reality. Now that we, in the West, especially, inhabit a totalitarian world, the web of committees is global, and links all social institutions within the nation. Once that vast system has reached consensus on something, there is a virtual reality of vast scale and complex interlinkage to reinforce the virtual reality of consensus. There is no way in for real reality. Indeed, there is no way even to acknowledge the separateness of real reality, thus no way to compare real reality with the virtuality of consensus. Individuals have, en masse, made the choice that their own personal experience, reason, common sense are unreliable ways of knowing, and therefore need to be subordinated to committee consensus. And, once that choice has been made, belief becomes something external to be obeyed, not something for which any individual is personally responsible. And, once that something external is a committee, functioning in a bureaucracy of their committees, then we are in a world where committee consensus defines reality, and real reality might as well not exist, without any regard of what yours or my personal judgment may say on the matter. Consequently, it is possible, perhaps normal, that the things everybody believes in terms of public discourse, are things that individuals do not believe. Yet they have pre-decided that independent personal discernment ought to be suppressed, therefore they absolutely believe whatever nonsense is committee consensus. And such individuals cannot, in principle, under any circumstances, ever take responsibility to abandon that committee-derived consensus reality, because to do that would be evil, and dangerous. The exclusion of love, the worst possible sin. Bruce Charlton. I know it's off the point, Havard interjects, but I'd like to ask Williams what he would regard as the worst possible sin. Williams answers without a moment's hesitation, the exclusion of love. Havard nods. From Thursday evenings, an imaginative recreation of a meeting, closely based on documentary sources, in The Inklings, by Humphrey Carpenter, 1979. For many years found Charles Williams's idea of the worst possible sin to be impressive, and yet also puzzling. I later came across the place where Williams gave this judgment, and from which Carpenter derived the quotation, but unfortunately I have now forgotten where this was published. Although for somewhat different reasons than Williams, I also regard the exclusion of love as a deep insight into sin, rooted in the ultimate nature of reality. For Christians, love is, metaphysically speaking, the ultimate cause and reason for creation. Therefore, the exclusion of love is the primary sin, because it rejects and opposes divine creation itself. This is important, because men are easily distracted by more spectacular and positive sins, but it is worth remembering that these are, in a sense, just a means to the end of the exclusion of love. and also that the exclusion of love may be at work, as a motivation, in the nature of men or other beings, even when spectacular sins are entirely absent. Many large and powerful aspects of modern life are a material embodiment of the exclusion of love, such as bureaucracy in general, and social systems such as law, the economy, and mass media. The modern institution is a domain where procedures dominate. Love is excluded from operations ever more completely, and consequently an environment where loveless and love-hating, cold, soulless, psychopathic, manipulative careerists thrive. And the worst of positive sins is probably spite, and that too can be seen as a consequence of the exclusion of love. Where love is present, spite can never work unopposed, but without love, spite can become master. The anti-spiritual aim of committees like Davos. Francis Berger. A recently leaked document claims to list the people who will participate in the Davos Crew's annual Globalist Summit in Switzerland in a few days. As always, the participant list reveals just how sweeping and far-reaching the nature of system power and influence is, and that's without including the hundreds of thousands or millions of other, lower or higher-ranking system apparatchiks, the hundreds of millions of dupes who zealously parrot the agenda, or the billions of drones who haplessly follow along in a mindless trance. The World Economic Forum provides the list to all attendees so that they can use it for the sole purpose of personal communication and dialogue in furtherance of the forum's mission, which in this case, encompasses the litmus test issues and all the other great stuff we have had the intense displeasure of experiencing since 2020. From a broader perspective, the WEF is simply a global committee connected to countless other global, international, national, municipal, and local committees, all of which purport to be working to make the world a better place via global agenda items like climate change action, net zero carbon emissions, social inclusivity, the fourth industrial revolution, economic transformation, financial equity, human rights, and so forth. On the surface, these committees, and global node committees like the WEF, all appear to be working toward exclusively material and worldly aims. I assume most Davos attendees are oblivious to the underlying anti-spiritual aims within the forum's mission and the mission of all committees in general. In a nutshell, one of the underlying anti-spiritual aims of all committees and the agendas they promulgate is to hinder and obliterate the development of consciousness within individual human beings. We have reached a point in history in which man has become capable of answering the call of God. More precisely, we have reached a stage where man possesses the potential to utilize his freedom to consciously choose to align with God and creation, thereby overcoming the giveness of the world and setting the stage for the possibility of higher spiritual achievements. Put more simply, man has gained the potential to draw closer to God and reality via his consciousness if he so chooses. Though the vast majority of humanity is unconscious of this development, the higher forces opposing God and creation are acutely aware of it. Moreover, they are doing everything within their power to ensure human beings remain oblivious by keeping consciousness grounded in the external, material, unreality of the given world. As Dr. Charlton explained yesterday, one of the most effective means to achieve this anti-spiritual goal is committee consensus. Committees like the WEF profess to have nothing but noble, worldly aims. An increasing number of people have discerned that these worldly aims are anything but noble. Though commendable, this discernment alone will not count for much if the far more grievous and devastating anti-spiritual goals are not discerned. Note added, even a cursory glance at the Davos participant list is enough to understand that all well-meaning calls to topple the system in the West are specious. No group or movement would stand a chance against the system, not even in its current state of self-sabotage. Moreover, a physical insurrection unsupported by spiritual motivations and convictions would likely do little to improve the overall situation. As it stands now, the only effective and most meaningful way to topple the system is via consciousness and the spirit, which is why system distancing remains a spiritual imperative. What is the spiritual work of old age? Bruce Charlton. I assume here that there is indeed a spiritual role for old age, and that aging is not merely decline. That fact that God maintains someone alive means that person has work of spiritual importance to be done. In the first place, there is the chance for salvation, and secondly for spiritual progression towards higher consciousness, i.e. to make conscious and freely choose those goods which were previously unconscious and spontaneous. But these are personal spiritual jobs, and we are not isolated beings but are some part of networks of love of neighbors as the Gospels call it. Therefore, as well as personal or private work, old age also has a task of social or public spiritual work to do. In other words, in old age each person has spiritual work to do for the general benefit. What seems to happen is that the material for such work comes to mind spontaneously, but the work itself requires agency. What we need to work on will come to mind without specific effort, but the positive spiritual work that needs doing requires discernment and right choices, and, as usual, there are temptations, wrong choices, that point in harmful and evil directions. In old age, attention naturally tends to switch from the present and future towards the past. Thus, it is a true stereotype of old age that certain memories or themes recur, and the old person tends to go over and over events from his past, privately, and perhaps in conversation. Places, people, events, past decisions. These are examples of the kind of things that recur. They may recur by being reminded of them in everyday life, coming to mind in reflection or daydreaming, or in actual dreams. A particular thing may be the one subject of recurrent interest, and there may be a few, or many unchanging things. This difference depends on what the individual most needs to do, and is capable of doing. Interest in these themes is spontaneous, but may be sustained or brief. Which happens in a particular person will depend on the individual's needs and capabilities. Some people need to work hard on one matter, while another person may need to survey many things, and become aware of their implications. These form the material of spiritual activity, and the task is to work on this material in the proper way, which is spiritual and inner rather than physical and outer, and with proper aims, which are directed at spiritual outcomes in eternal resurrected life, rather than material outcomes in this mortal life. Although the material appears as memories, ultimately what is being worked on is not what modern society regards as memories. Instead, what is being worked on are past realities that survive in present creation, survive in the thinking of active beings. What come to mind is, presumably, shaped by our personal needs, as ascertained by that which is divine in each man, in the context of being in harmony with the aims and loving nature of divine creation, as shaped by the Holy Ghost. In other words, we are given as material not only what is important to our salvation and spiritual development, but also what is important to other beings in ongoing divine creation. And important is here understood in terms of post-mortal, resurrected and eternal life, not by the temporary and material aspects of this mortal and earthly life. The process of working on these memories is therefore not in terms of public use, and does not need to be communicated to other people. It is a matter of having the right kind of thoughts, not about saying, nor doing, the right kind of things. The right kind of thoughts involve things like becoming aware of that which was unconscious, re-evaluating that which was misunderstood, grasping the wider context of that which was seen in isolation. In generic terms, we are called upon to bring to awareness from our own unique personal perspective things of the past, and to create new understandings, and to make new links and contexts. In sum, This is creative work. It is the work of changing and enhancing divine creation, by, in effect, picking up unfinished or wrongly understood business for our past and knowledge, and making new and better understandings, adding meanings, and making relationships. All guided by the aims and, loving, methods of divine creation. It is work that only we ourselves can do, because our nature and perspective is unique. If we, personally, do not do this work, then it will not be done, and creation will be otherwise than it would have been. Therefore, old age is not meant to be passive and reactive merely. There is work to be done, but spiritual, not physical work, and not necessarily involving other people in material terms. That work will come to mind spontaneously, and then the active job is to review, consider, evaluate it, contextualize that material, in a spirit of love. To emphasize, the work itself is not automatic, the process of working must be chosen, and choices need to be active. And there are many potential temptations that can derail the work from its proper aims, methods and conclusions, and lead to harm instead of benefit. Indeed, it would seem that most old people nowadays fall prey to one or more of these temptations, and end by doing spiritual harm to themselves, and failing to benefit their neighbors. For example, they may react wrongly, in the wrong spirit, to the material brought up by memories. In the first place, they may regard the whole business as physical, not spiritual, and earthly, not eternal. Some people may brood resentfully and recurrently on, real or imagined, past wrongs done to them. Others engage in wishful thinking and vain regrets, that they had, or had not, done something, which they suppose would have then made their past or present lives better. Others may cycle and recycle remembered material superficially or verbatim, over and again, but without ever bring to consciousness new aspects, or striving to learn from it. Or people may use past memories with an aim to ameliorate or improve present mortal life, perhaps by trying to attain higher status through memories of self-aggrandizement, or by seeking excuses/rationalizations for present sins. Another spiritual mistake is simply to regard memories as nothing more than opportunities for pleasurable reminiscence, merely a chance for feeling better here and now, and passing the time pleasantly. So there are innumerable ways of derailing the task of old age, but also there is real and valuable work potentially to be done. And so long as God maintains us alive, the old can choose to do this work. This mortal life on earth, on the one hand. On the other. Bruce Charlton. On the one hand. On the other. On the one hand, there are truly wonderful experiences in life, for those open to them and who regard reality as meaningful. How can it have become normal and unremarkable for so many people so blandly to assume that ultimate reality is without purpose or meaning? How have we arrived at a point when this is officially true, officially taught, and a background assumption to all mainstream public discourse? This is an utterly nihilistic and inevitably despair-inducing basis for life, but it is unremarkable normality for almost everyone. How can this be just unremarkable common sense for so many men and organizations? And, having made this life-destroying assumption of a purposeless and meaningless reality, why is this position so vehemently defended? On the other hand, we have the essential unsatisfactoriness of life as a whole, of this mortal life bounded by birth and death. It's not that good things don't happen, but when they do happen, they are never enough. One might have the happiest or most transformative spiritual experience. But what then? Life goes on, and on. Mortal life just is not good enough and never has been, and all honest and competent men have always known this. The mortal life of man is unsatisfactory at worst, overall, on average, and, even, among the saints and geniuses. No man's life has ever been good enough, on the whole, no matter how wonderful our moments and parts. Those who say otherwise, that this mortal life is sufficient and good of itself, are ignorant, dishonest, or engaging in a desperate form of wishful thinking. Understandably, in light of the mainstream nihilism, and such falsehoods are the only way that they can motivate themselves to keep going. No matter what true, profound and inspiring experience, life is experienced as not solidly meaningful, ragged, incoherent, and often or usually at a much lower level than it ought to be. And if, at this moment, one thinks otherwise, then that is wrong. If a cult develops to pretend the perfection of any person, some leader, some figurehead, it will be deluded and wrong. Infrequent patchiness of goodness, rightness, elevation, is the best attainable state. The reason why is that this mortal life on earth is a transitional phase. Of its nature it is not intended to be a thing in itself. Because life is mortal, and this world is entropic, all is transient, man's life and the earth are not designed/are designed not to be independently sufficient. When viewed from within this mortal life, we discover its infinite promise, yet inevitable unsatisfactoriness. Only when viewed from a perspective beyond this mortal life may we realize what it's all about, and why it is this way it is. But such a view cannot make the unsatisfactory sufficient. We are still inside the same situation as before. Only, now we know why. Time to stand apart. William Wildblood. The time has arrived when the full meaning of the saying that he who is not with me is against me, Matthew 12:30, has become apparent. There is no more fence-sitting. You can no longer simply be a good person or even a spiritual or religious person in a generalized sense, for if you are likely to be caught up and absorbed by the universal inversion of true spiritual values that is well underway. If you don't consciously see this for what it is and actively stand out against it, you will become part of it. Remember that this inversion of values is always presented as a good thing and the acceptance of it the mark of a good person, so you do have to make an active stand against the good opinion of the world, though without lapsing into egotistic defiance or rebellion for the sake of it. What it does is reverse the hierarchical relationship between spirit and matter, putting the spiritual in a distorted form as existing only insofar as it reflects the requirements and priorities of the material. Good becomes this worldly good only. We are living at a time when the human sense of individuality has reached a peak. This is at once an opportunity, a test and a real danger. It is a danger in the sense that the consequences of a developed free will means our choices matter. In the past it may have been spiritually acceptable for our choices to be wrong if the culture in which we lived bent them that way. We were not regarded as so personally responsible because our individual sense of self had not been built up so much. Now we are responsible. The influences of the tribe, the culture, the society are no longer acceptable as extenuating circumstances. This also means that even believing the right thing is insufficient if that belief comes from outside. It must be personal, something we have reached through inner awareness. I have speculated before that the vastly increased population of the world at the present time may be because many souls are returning to make a definitive choice at a time when that choice will be theirs and not just their culture's. Human evolution has reached the point at which our inner metal can be tested. The test is made both harder and easier in that religion for most people in the West is no longer the default option. If we are going to believe, we must actively develop that belief without the coercion of the past. But then things are also made easier because the results of atheism and materialism are more and more apparent to the unprejudiced mind. God is asking us, is this what you want? There is an alternative, but you have to seek it out. It won't be given to you ready wrapped as before. If you want it, you must look for it, but if you do look for it, seriously and sincerely, you will find it. The human sense of individuality has reached a peak. William Wildblood. Bruce Charlton. William's short post captures, in a compressed form, something of great importance I have often thought about myself. I agree strongly with his point. In the past it may have been spiritually acceptable for our choices to be wrong if the culture in which we lived bent them that way. Now we are responsible. The influences of the tribe, the culture, the society are no longer acceptable as extenuating circumstances. Yet I see from all sides that many people cling to the assertion of their own irresponsibility as if they were still children, or lived in the past when the relationship of man and society was different, and the two were less distinct. On the contrary, to make such a claim of non-responsibility is in fact incoherent. Anyone who can claim that he is not responsible is, by that fact, responsible, or else the distinction could not be formulated. Only when someone lacks insight is he genuinely not responsible, and then he could not claim it. Catch-22. What is actually happening nowadays is a refusal to acknowledge actual responsibility. The individual chooses to pretend he has not made a decision that he has made, and thereby tries to give himself a private, and public, excuse, whereby he cannot be blamed. This usually happens because, in practice, the individual has chosen a cowardly course of submission to totalitarian evil in hope either of expedient personal advantage, or for fear of adverse consequences. Well, many of us lack courage, but it is the refusal to be honest with oneself that is so decisively self-damning, and leads to further sin by the habit of refusing the necessity to take responsibility and make individual discernments, even in the privacy of one's thoughts. It is this honesty with oneself and with God that matters ultimately, and which seems to be so lethally deficient in this time. Creativity, the third truth. Francis Berger. Christians tend to believe in two distinct paths toward truth. The first is divine revelation. The second is reason. Divine revelation comprises the truth God has revealed directly to man from above. Man arrives at reasoned truth empirically through his senses. As far as most Christians are concerned, there is no other viable way for man to access truth. Man receives it directly from God or figures it out via his senses. The first enlightens the second, and the second reveals the reality of the first. The big problem for Christians is the treasured belief that empirical truth, truth arrived at by reason, always leads to the reality of God. In actuality, empirical truth has all but rejected divine truth and the reality of God. The truth man has gathered from his senses has informed him that God does not exist. This conclusion is then reinforced by the apparent centuries-long absence of divine revelation. This apparent centuries-long absence of divine revelation has led empirical man to conclude that earlier divine revelations were untrue, in the sense that they never occurred. Now, Christians will argue that the reasoned truth man has employed in the past 2 or 3 centuries is not reasoned at all because it is insincere and skewed. The argument is not wrong, but its correctness misses the larger point of how and why man's use of empirical reason has become so insincere and skewed. I suggest that the insincere and skewed use of reasoned truth is rooted in man's inability to recognize a third form of truth, which I will refer to here as divine human revelation. To my knowledge, it was Berger who coined the term, and he used it to describe another, as of yet, largely unacknowledged path toward truth, which he called creativity, bold added in all passages. Creativeness is something mysterious and hidden. The revelation of creativeness does not come from above but rather from below. It is an anthropological, not a theological, revelation. God revealed his will to sinful man in the law and granted man the grace of redemption, sending into the world his only Son. And God awaits from man the anthropological revelation of creativity. In the name of man's godlike freedom, God has hidden from him the ways of creativeness and the justification of creativeness. Meaning of the creative act. Berger's introduction of an anthropological revelation turns the conventional Christian belief about revelation on its head and reveals a new and largely unexplored path toward truth. Instead of passively absorbing or waiting for God's revelation, man must realize that he must actively reveal himself to God via creativity. Moreover, he should be pursuing creativity from within himself, from the core of his agency and freedom, rather than relying upon external sources. Man's creative activity has no holy scriptures, its ways are not revealed to man from above. In the holy scriptures which reveal to man the will of God, man always finds absolute truth, but it is another kind of truth and about something other. In creativeness, man is, as it were, left to himself, alone, and has no direct aid from on high. And in this fact the great wisdom of God is evident. The meaning of the creative act. Creativity does not negate divine revelation or reasoned truth, but merges them, thereby ending the errant dichotomy that has been established between the two truths and, subsequently, affirming the existence of the form of truth simply through the conscious act of seeking it. Truth is not objective, ordinary reality, reflected in the knower and entering into him from outside, but rather the enlightenment, the transfiguration of reality. It is the introduction into the world's state of equality, which was not there before truth was revealed and known. Truth is not conformity with what we call being, but rather the kindling of a light within being. I am in darkness and seek the light, I do not yet know truth but I seek it. By this very fact, I affirm the existence of truth and light, existence in another sense than the existence of the world's realities. My seeking is already the dawning light, and truth already beginning to reveal itself. Truth and revelation. And what is the overall purpose of the third truth? According to Berger, the divine human revelation of creativity sets the stage for the continued development of human consciousness and the fulfillment of God's divine purpose for man. The opening of a new epoch of the spirit, which will include higher achievements of spirituality, presupposes a radical change and a new orientation in the human consciousness. This will be a revolution of consciousness which hitherto has been considered as something static. The religion of the spirit will be the religion of man's maturity, leaving behind him his childhood and adolescence. The divine and the human, and the core of God's divine purpose within the third truth involves raising man up to the level of co-creator. The creative act will create new being rather than values of differentiated culture. In the creative act, life will not be quenched. Creativity will continue creation, it will reveal the resemblance of human nature to the Creator. In creativity the way will be found for subject to pass into object, the identity of subject with object will be restored. All the great creators have foreseen this turning point. Today, in the depths of culture itself and in all its separate spheres, this crisis of creativity is ripening. Meaning of the creative act.